Do you define yourself as a MAGA communist?
Well, I'm happy to define myself as a MAGA communist. We are against both the Democratic and Republican parties. A proud and strong America should actually be working with other countries cooperatively in win-win cooperation instead of acting as the world's policemen or only acting on behalf of our political and financial elites. You know, if you look at countries around the world that have undergone the experience of socialist, communist, or progressive revolutions, a lot of these countries, whether we're talking about China or Russia or even Iran, have moved forward their traditions, their faiths, and protected those and preserved those today. But we actually see Trump as a logical development in American politics. And he's kind of a result of the contradictions of the United States coming to fruition and coming out in the open. So if the Trump administration and people like Tulsi Gabbard are serious about draining the swamp and getting rid of these corrupt establishment elites, they're going to have a lot of work on their hands. And my expectation is that they will not be successful. When Trump gets into office, he will have to come to a sober recognition of the reality on the battlefield. And if they're serious about ending this war, they have to recognize and work with the legitimate interests of the Russian Federation.
You are a patriot. So how do you evaluate this patriotism with protectionism? Is it patriotism, or what is your opinion?
This is a great question. You're right, it's complicated. I am an American patriot. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'm a communist, but I'm an American patriot. Fundamentally, I want what's best for the American working people. I want our people to have strong industries, good jobs. And so while tariffs might have some limited use, what we fundamentally need is an economy that is owned and controlled and directed by the working class itself.
Hello, everybody. Today, John Molera is our guest. He is the member of the political bureau of the, I think nowadays, one of the most famous political parties in the United States, the Amerikan Komünist Party. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. It's very interesting times, so I know that we'll have a lot of interesting topics to discuss.
Definitely. Thank you for your time. I mean, a lot of people are, I know, curious about your party, and we are talking and asking each other. So first of all, I want to ask you, do you define yourself as a MAGA communist?
Well, I'm happy to define myself as a MAGA communist. That's fine with me. A lot of people have been using this. It really started as a meme, which was a recognition that there was a very strong revolutionary potential in the MAGA movement itself. And that ultimately what we were going to see over the course of the development of American politics was going to be this class consciousness coming about in many of our rural areas and small towns. And MAGA, in our evaluation, really represented the beginning of this. And so one of our members, our chairman, Chairman Haz Aldin, actually kind of coined this term and popularized it, MAGA communism. Of course, it struck a lot of people as inherently contradictory because in many people's minds, MAGA and communism, these are things that oppose each other. Communism and the people that have been associated with Trump have been, by appearances, at odds. But our evaluation was a little bit deeper, and we were kind of trying to explore the real reason for the development of MAGA. I'm definitely fine to be called a MAGA communist, but I prefer an American communist because I think that what we're really talking about is not a division between Republicans or Democrats, but we're trying to build a movement of the entire American working class. So I think that this is the most important piece.
Okay. And what is basically the purpose of the party? What is your goals?
Well, we recognize the dire straits that America is in. The trajectory that our country is on is not a good one. Over the last couple of decades, we've had more and more people fall into poverty. You go into American cities and you see cities rife with homelessness, drug addiction. For most Americans who are still making it, they're struggling to get by month to month. Most Americans are riddled with debt. Debt is one of the biggest issues that we see facing our country, both at the personal level and at the national level. At the personal level, many Americans are tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Of course, on the national level, our debt has ballooned exponentially. And to note one very prominent and notable statistic, every dollar that the American taxpayer is paying, for 40% of that, so 40 cents to every dollar that the American taxpayer is paying, is going to pay off the interest on our national debt. Not pay down the national debt, but pay the very interest on our debt. So we see that our society more and more has become captured by these large financial interest, big banks, corporate monopolies that are running roughshod over the American people. And increasingly, they also have total political control. And the result of this is that things are getting more difficult for the average American. People are barely able to make ends meet, barely able to pay their rent month to month. Most Americans are in a position where they're no longer owning property, owning their land. And the future of our younger generations is very bleak. Most young Americans, if they want to get a higher education, have to go tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. So we are looking at a society where more and more people are alienated, and we're beginning to experience the social effects of that, right? We're seeing these diseases of despair become more prominent, and we're actually seeing life expectancy itself decline. But especially prominent are the things like the mental health crises that we see in many of our states, the social disunity and dysfunction. And that manifests itself politically in all sorts of political violence, decay, distrust in our institutions. And so we see that America is at a very important crossroads. Also, at the same time, as we have this massive financial elite and corporate monopoly, military-industrial complex, which dominates our U.S. politics, we are seeing an increase in aggression abroad, the use of sanctions, and in some cases, of course, war being implemented by our political leaders against the perceived adversaries of the United States in order to prevent this changing global world that is shifting away from this unipolar domination by the United States and European elites toward a more multipolar one, where other societies and civilizations are beginning to assert their interests. And so all of this has created a number of crises that threaten to cascade and have real effects on the American people. And the initiative of our party is to address this fundamentally at its roots. We see a fundamental failure of both the Democratic and Republican parties to address these issues. We see that they have been captured completely by corporate power, by these large financial interests, by these massive lobbying groups, which basically decide the direction of the US government. And we're saying that in order to really address the problems in American society, we need a political movement that is expressly on behalf of working people. And this is the role of the American Communist Party. In our party platform, we address abolishing the debt as our first policy point. Throughout our party program, we also talk about ending US imperialism. We talk about addressing an economic bill of rights for all Americans, about how we can utilize the developments of technology and industry to actually serve the American people, rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, and provide a basic standard of living of dignity for all Americans, and to ensure that America moving forward into the future is a country, a nation, a civilization that can work cooperatively with other countries instead of spreading war and hostility.
To get into it deeper, what distinguishes you from the other left parties? For instance, there's also the Communist Party of the United States and other left parties. And what is your biggest criticism towards them?
This is a great question. And I think this is fundamental to the reason why we started this party. Many of these left parties in the United States, whether it's the CPUSA or others, have shown time and again that they're really just the more radical or liberal wing of the Democratic Party. They have elevated a lot of issues like culture war issues, social issues as the primary issues that they focus on, to the extent to which they are willing to alienate and push away other members of the working class if they don't have these progressive outlooks and ideologies when it comes to social issues. For example, the fixation on the promotion of LGBT ideology as something that is fundamental to a left movement. And we recognize that throughout the country, people have different views when it comes to culture, tradition, religion. And we believe that instead of dictating to the working class what their social outlook has to be, we have to work with the people where they are. And this isn't to excuse like some of the most reactionary ideologies that are present in some of our rural areas and small towns, but rather we need to connect with the working people all across the country and help us come into one unified political movement. And we believe that in order to do that, we have to focus on the economic conditions, on the insane levels of corruption and inequality that are plaguing not only our cities and university areas, where a lot of these left parties have remained insular, but also many of our farming communities that have been left behind, that have also suffered greatly from the monopolization of farmland, the loss of civic communities in small towns. And so instead of having this position where we aim to attack and destroy the traditions and religions and the different cultural practices of the American people, we believe that it is actually the capitalist system. It is capitalism itself. It is, as I mentioned, the domination of our politics by a financial elite that is destroying our civic life, that is destroying our community and our traditions, and that actually a communist movement and a movement, a genuine left movement, would seek to elevate and sublate our culture, our tradition, our sense of national unity. And on that last point, I think that this is an important point as well. What we've seen from a lot of, especially the more radical left parties in the United States, is a complete denunciation of America as a whole. In many cases, we see people kind of drift into this national nihilism, where they say that everything about America is bad, that we need to oppose America fundamentally, this kind of anti-patriotic attitude that has taken root in the left that really seeks to destroy rather than build. And the problem with this is that, number one, it is just antithetical to left movements, communist and socialist movements throughout history, which have utilized patriotism and have been patriotic in their own right. And then also it pushes away the mass of working people from actually connecting to a genuine class politics. The reality is that in the United States, most people, whether or not they support the government, they love their country. These people, the people who live here, the vast majority of people who live here from every demographic, including every minority demographic, identify as Americans. And so I think it's very important for us, instead of having this attitude of national nihilism, where we act as if we just need to destroy the country and start from whole cloth, we need to recognize that we are all American people, that we need to take pride and responsibility in being Americans. And that as we move into the future, a proud and strong America should actually be working with other countries cooperatively in win-win cooperation, instead of acting as the world's policemen or only acting on behalf of our political and financial elites. But instead, we need to go back to the founding principles of this country in some respects and elevate them to modern times, which is to establish a government, a true government of, by, and for the people. And we also need to recognize that America has a long and rich history of revolution, of progressive revolution. And when it comes to reclaiming a sovereignty that is based around the needs of working people, we can draw from our history instead of just throwing it in the dustbin of history. And I think that this is actually a much more effective way to move forward and bring people into a genuine progressive movement.
Some would call you, I think, now after your remarks, left conservative. Maybe you named the other leftist parties, some of them as radicals and progressive, etc., and especially your remarks and opinions about the cultural perspective. So, would you describe yourself as a left conservative?
I don't know if this is the best. I don't know if this is the best description. I think that it's fine. However people want to describe me, I have no problem with. Quite frankly, I would describe myself as a communist. I would describe myself as a socialist and a supporter of working class politics in the United States. But I do think that
I just wanted to provocate you a little,
yeah.
because communism and conservatism is not, very close to each other. But I mean, nowadays we are discussing, of course, these kind of things.
Sure. Well, I think that the history of communism does have some conservative elements to it. And maybe I'll go into that a little bit. I actually gave a speech recently on socialism and tradition. And it is interesting because, if you look at countries around the world that have undergone the experience of socialist, communist, or progressive revolutions, a lot of these countries, whether we're talking about China or Russia or even Iran, have moved forward their traditions, their faiths, and protected those and preserved those today. And it's actually many of these, what we describe as liberal democracies of the West, that have eroded and kind of thrown away many of their national traditions and things that have unified their societies for generations. And so I think that there's this kind of interesting contradiction where this flame of revolution, this flame of progressive revolution, it's often described as a destructive flame, right? But I would actually assert that it's more of a purifying one. And we saw this, for example, with the Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, in the early days, there was a large reaction against the corruption in the church. But over a period of years, there was also a revival of the Orthodox Church. Stalin revived, Lenin and Stalin both revived many of the national traditions of Russia, and Stalin personally really did a lot to restore the Orthodox Church, and I think that it laid a foundation for the sustainability of these institutions going into the future. So it's kind of this interesting contradiction where I think that a genuinely socialist left movement has a role in preserving and elevating the traditions of the people to fit with the modern modes of production and the modern kind of era of geopolitics.
Here is a maybe controversial question. Some of your members who are also famous on social media, for instance, Jackson Hinkle and also other friends of you, they have openly supported, I think, Donald Trump. Is that the official policy of your party?
No, the official position of our party is that we are against both the Democratic and Republican parties. But we do recognize, and as some of our members have recognized, that Donald Trump, many on the left saw him as this aberration, right? This Hitlerite figure that was just something that was totally unique and terrible in American politics. But we actually see Trump as a logical development in American politics. And he's kind of a result of the contradictions of the United States coming to fruition and coming out in the open. And so with Donald Trump, we do see an opportunity, a real important opportunity to advance class politics in this country and to reveal the contradictions of our ruling class. The Donald Trump presidency, there was a lot of interesting things that happened over the course of his presidency. There was a lot that he did wrong, and there were some things that he did well. Of course, they continued a lot of this great power kind of conflict and this pivot toward escalating tensions with China and in some cases Russia. And then, of course, in the Middle East, where we saw General Soleimani very unjustly and tragically killed by a strike that was ordered by the former President Trump, soon to be president-elect, of course. But so we recognize that Trump is not a panacea, but we also saw this tendency with Trump to have relations with other countries that the United States has long labeled its adversaries and refused to even have discussions with. For example, Trump was willing to have discussions with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, of course, Vladimir Putin. There's also a famous story about how Trump was planning on having a meeting with President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, but he was actually blocked and prevented from by his handlers and others in the administration who wanted to continue this neoconservative policy of aggression and sanctions toward Venezuela. So Trump's cabinet this time is also laden with contradictions. On one hand, you have people like RFK and Tulsi Gabbard and others who have been critical of the escalating war and NATO's involvement in Ukraine. But of course, you also have many of these neoconservatives, once again, who will play prominent roles. People like Marco Rubio, who has never really met a war that he hasn't liked. And then, of course, most of the administration, most of the appointees so far have also been staunch supporters of Israel and their actions and ongoing genocide against the people of Gaza and Palestine. So it is a complicated situation. But I think that what some of our prominent members have been able to recognize is that Trump does connect with this impulse of the American people that is just fed up with the system of neoliberalism and neoconservatism that has dominated American politics. And they want somebody who's going to be able to shake that up, to challenge the status quo, and go after many of these corrupt establishment elites that have set us on a path toward destruction and chaos, and also inflamed tensions with the rest of the world. So I think it's been a bit of a complicated and strategic social media strategy on behalf of some of our members in order to kind of draw out this recognition.
You mentioned Tulsi Gabbard. Do you have high hopes or, let's say, expectations for especially Tulsi Gabbard? I mean, will they be able to, how they called it in the campaign, dismantle the deep state?
I think that it's going to be a very rocky and interesting ride. I've never been one for making predictions because, as you know, things can go sideways very quickly. Who knows? Hopefully, we're not in a real world war before Trump even takes office. And then that could obviously color the direction of U.S. policy, of our national security policy quite profoundly. So I definitely want to be hesitant on making any predictions. I do think as I said, it will create a lot of conflict within the administration, right? Because now you're going to have different voices, different interests pushing against one another. And of course, from administration to administration, there's a lot of continuity, not necessarily in these high-level cabinet positions, but in the lower-level positions at the administrative level, there's a lot of continuity. So if the Trump administration and people like Tulsi Gabbard are serious about draining the swamp and getting rid of these corrupt establishment elites, they're going to have a lot of work on their hands. And my expectation is that they will not be successful because they have not made the totally correct analysis that in order to fundamentally change this country, in order to really root out corruption, we need a politics that is based fundamentally in the interests of the working class. It's not going to be done just from this ideological level of, we need to go against the deep state, but we need to be clear and decisive about how does this deep state function? Who supports this deep state? Who do they act on the interest of? In order to truly change the dynamics of U.S. politics, the actions of our national security state, the priorities of our military-industrial complex. So I think that this is one of the most fundamental pieces. But what I do expect is an increased opening to be able to expose some of the contradictions in the system. Because, you know, with people like Tulsi Gabbard holding high-level cabinet positions, or even someone like Donald Trump, of course, this demonstrates the hypocrisy in our law enforcement agencies and the way that they treat the American people. I think that this was also very highlighted by the felony charges that Trump faced, right? Where you have a number of these charges that are being leveled against Trump from a jurisdiction that is strongly controlled by the Democratic Party in New York. And the people are seeing these felonies go toward Trump and in people's minds for seemingly political reasons that don't have a real impact on their daily lives. And they're recognizing that, once again, look, our system of law enforcement is fundamentally corrupt. The court system is fundamentally corrupt and targets its political enemies. And so I think that all of these things, people like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, others, it will provide us the opportunity to, again, expose some of these contradictions and some of the hypocrisy that is latent in the American political system.
I have some questions about the U.S. foreign policy. Recently, the Biden administration's decision on long-range missiles, ATACMS. Do you think that this is an attempt to basically sabotage the Trump administration? And as a following question, do you think that Donald Trump can end the war in Ukraine, as he claimed?
I think that it will be incredibly, incredibly difficult. To go to your first question, this is almost certainly an effort by the Biden administration and others surrounding the administration to strengthen the algorithm toward war. And what we desperately need at this time is a strong signal from the incoming Trump administration that there is still a willingness to negotiate, that they do not support, and in fact, they should state that they denounce these the use of long-range U.S. missiles by the Ukrainian army against the territory of the Russian Federation. So I think that this is incredibly critical in this moment, that we have a strong signal from the incoming administration that we do not want war, that the American people voted him in because they want peace, and that this is his mandate. The Biden administration, I, of course, don't think that Biden is really in charge. I saw the Lenin mausoleum a couple of weeks ago, and quite frankly, Lenin's cadaver looked more alive than Joe Biden does today. But, of course, the people in the Biden administration have long been pushing this war, long been pushing this escalation and this hostility toward Russia. And this only strengthens that calculation, because Russia is now in a position where they will be forced to respond. And just this morning, we saw the reported use of intercontinental ballistic missiles by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian territory. So what we have seen over the course of the last week is a strong increase in the algorithm toward war, and it will make it harder when the Trump administration comes into office to scale back a wider conflict. I think that there were already problems that existed prior to the U.S. allowing Ukraine to use its long-range weapons systems on the territory of the Russian Federation. For example, Trump was always unclear during the campaign how exactly he would end the conflict in a day. He promised time and again, I'm going to end the conflict the day I step into office. I'll have a call with Putin. He went as far to say that when he's elected, after he's elected, he'll end the conflict. Of course, it hasn't ended. It's only escalated. But the problem here is that Russia holds all the cards. Russia currently has the leverage on the battlefield. They've advanced on virtually every front, but especially in the 4 separatist territories. Russia has consolidated its hold, and there really is no way that Russia is just going to allow this territory that is remaining to not come into Russian hands. The other big issue, of course, is Ukraine's NATO ascension. And Trump was asked directly, well, will you, when you get into office, come to terms with President Putin that he's laid out, which are the basically the annexation of the Donbass, Luhansk, the 4 oblasts in the east, that Ukraine would not become a part of NATO, and that there would be this continued effort to denazify Ukraine to ensure there's not a hostile Ukrainian government on the borders of the Russian Federation. And Trump was asked directly, will you accept these terms? And Trump said no. So there will definitely be a ways to go in terms of any type of negotiation or settlement to end the conflict. I do, however, think that when Trump gets into office, he will have to come to a sober recognition of the reality on the battlefield. And if they're serious about ending this war, they have to recognize and work with the legitimate interests of the Russian Federation.
Okay, here is one last, maybe a difficult but interesting, I think, and I'm curious about your opinion, question. As we all know, Trump says he will follow a protectionist economy in the name of patriotism. So all the things about the high tariffs against China and other things about the European Union, etc. And I mean, you are a patriot. So how do you evaluate this patriotism with protectionism? Is it patriotism, or what is your opinion?
This is a great question. You're right, it's complicated. I am an American patriot. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'm a communist, but I'm an American patriot. Fundamentally, I want what's best for the American working people. I want our people to have strong industries, good jobs. I want our people to be able to go to the grocery store and not have to spend their entire income on their food and their basic necessities, their rent. These things we've all seen go through the roof over the course of the last 4 years, but it's of course not only been the last 4 years, but the last several decades, where we've seen the cost of living for the working class not keep up with our wages. And the deindustrialization that we've seen in the Rust Belt and other parts of America have really hurt the American working class. They've shattered entire communities and left people behind. And so it's understandable that some of our politicians are now shifting toward this idea of tariffs in order to rebuild our economy, protect American jobs, and so on. But the problem is that tariffs are not the silver bullet. They're kind of a scapegoat, especially now that conservatives are trying to use in order to not address the more fundamental needs of the economy, which are how things are owned, how things are produced, and where the value of those things that are produced and distributed, where that goes. And that has not been to the working class. On the issue of tariffs, tariffs are a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm not dogmatic. I think that one of the things that communists are often accused of is being ideological, but I have always hung my hat on being pragmatic, and I think that all communists and genuine leftists should be, if we're actually wanting to advance the interests of the working class. And tariffs, in some instances, might have a limited use in protecting key industries, the interests of the interest of American communities that are important and critical to sustaining life and the civic community and just our bonds of sociality with one another. But the other reality is that in today's modern economy, our supply chains are fundamentally interconnected. You're not going to just revive an American economy of the past by implementing tariffs. And in many cases, these tariffs fall to the working class. They result in higher prices on commodities and goods without necessarily bringing back the jobs that America has lost. So I think that it's a complicated issue. But more than anything, we need a cooperative relationship with China. We recognize that China has a very important role to play in the international community, and many other countries are recognizing this as well. We saw the ascension of numerous other countries into BRICS over the course of the last year. And the gravity of our geopolitical economy is shifting toward not only China, but also Southwest Asia, countries like Iran, Russia, and Africa. And we are going to have to be able to build new industries, new modern industries in the United States that are competitive. And so while tariffs might have some limited use, what we fundamentally need is an economy that is owned and controlled and directed by the working class itself. And without this fundamental piece, tariffs will not serve the working people, but could result in harmful trade wars, could result in higher prices on goods and services that will just impact the American people further. And for an American working class that is already struggling with the negative impacts of inflation, we've seen this runaway inflation that is just devastating American families. We have to be very attuned to this. And so it's my position that starting unnecessary and harmful trade wars or implementing tariffs with a very heavy hand, not in a pragmatic and skillful way, will be detrimental and actually be counterproductive to the interests of the American people.
John Molera, Thank you for your time. It was a very interesting conversation, and we are following the developments closely, and I hope we can meet in the future again.
Definitely. Let's do this in person next time.
Yeah, definitely.